There are tons of huge misconceptions in Overwatch 2 that are holding so many players back, and the problem with them is they keep getting repeated and repeated, so everyone starts to believe them, and they not only ruin your development as a player, but the development as the community as a whole. So we're gonna break all the misconceptions down, starting off with the first and maybe most egregious one, the stat problem. Now, this is actually just a continuation of the medals problem that was in Overwatch 1, and then when we got stats, players were like, yay, we get to know exactly how our team's doing, how much damage, how much healing, what they're accomplishing, so then we can definitively know who is feeding on our team and who is popping off on our team. But there's a ton of problems with stats. There's a huge amount of problems with stats. Let's first talk about one of the biggest ones, the healing stat and the damage stat. Well, first off, let's talk about the healing stat. We already talked about this before, but supports are not healers, and just healing is not going to win you a game. The impact of a support is not always directly connected to their healing. In fact, most of the time it's not. Let's take a Kiriko for an example, a character that can bait out a ton of cooldowns, get kills, make plays herself, save her team, but one Kiriko on one side of the table has a huge amount of healing, maybe close to 25-30% more. But the Kiriko that has far less healing is actually doing a lot more to win the team fight. And when you're winning, no one says anything, but when you're losing, you're like, look at their Kiriko's healing compared to our Kiriko's healing. It's no wonder we lose, when your Kiriko might actually be playing way better and more correct than the enemy Kiriko. And it gets even worse than that because overemphasis on these stats actually encourage you to play poorly. So let's say you're a Lucio main and you're like, oh, I have this much healing per 10. I'm insane. I'm in the top 1% of healing. When you look at Grandmaster Lucios, top 500 Lucios, or Pro Lucios, the amount of healing they're doing is astronomically lower than the amount of healing that someone in the low ranks would be doing. And you might be wondering why that is. It's because the utility that Lucio actually provides is his speed boost. And while healing is definitely a good part of his kit when you need it, the majority of the time, increasing your teammates' speed is going to allow them to get out of damage quicker, execute on the enemy quicker, and forward the momentum of a team fight. So this is one example of many where you take the stats at face value and it not only is just wrong to do, but it actually encourages poor play. Now, going back to the damage argument, some characters just do more raw or trash damage than others. If you're someone that is often just doing a lot of damage like a Junkrat, you might have more damage than someone that is doing giant amounts of burst damage like a Genji or a Widow, because you're being very strategic with the damage that you're doing. And this is another situation where no one complains about the damage when you're winning, right? Like a Genji could be 24-2 and have relatively lower damage than his DPS counterpart that isn't doing that much, but the second that you're losing, people will flame the damage. And this is another problem where you could be encouraged to just farm tanks or do as much trash damage as possible, damage that isn't actually leading to kills, but damage that is padding your stats because you don't want to get flamed for damage. Huge misconceptions that just create problems in your development, make you play wrong, and are just flat out wrong in the first place. Now, this leads me into the next question that is always asked. Do all stats not matter? Like, is there anything that we can get from the stats? And the thing is, stats can matter. You just have to take the context of the situation into account. So, like, if you did have a Kiriko on your team that had 0 damage, like actually 0 damage, I would say that's probably a little bit strange. Or a Genji who has 5 elims and 10 deaths, that's probably a little bit strange as well. But I want you to not also just chalk up a player performing poor to a problem with their skill. Oftentimes, there are certain conditions that are not being met that you can help fulfill. So, for example, you could have a Genji that is feeding over and over and over again, but all of a sudden y'all swap to dive, and then by the end of the game, that Genji just completely popped off because he was trying to force a play style in a situation that it wasn't working. He was hoping for resources that he didn't get. Now, I'm not trying to defend that Genji by any means, but understand that if you just try to harp on stats and just relate that directly to skill level and use it as a tool to flame people, you're never going to get the result that you actually want, which is to win, right? And we'll move on to the next big problem and huge misconception that happens in Overwatch, and it's the swap so that you can counter X. This is a very common thing that happens where you're up against some problematic character and people on your team want you to swap. And it could be a million different things. Hey, they have a monkey. Swap to Roadhog, swap to Brig, swap to Reaper. Or, hey, they have a Pharah. Let's swap to Soldier. Let's swap to Widowmaker. Let's swap to Diva. Just swap everything so that we can counter this one character. And there's a lot of problems with the counter X mindset. Now, I'm not saying that counters don't exist and there aren't characters that have good and bad matchups, because there are, but it's important to understand that things aren't as easy as swap to X character, it counters X thing. Like, we look in the Overwatch League and we see Reapers are being played on both teams up against Winstons, and the common community precedent is that Winston just gets completely dominated by a Reaper. But is that actually true? Well, if you're a Reaper that jumps in and doesn't even acknowledge the Reaper, jumps in, hopes that you can survive against a Reaper diving right on top of him, sure, you get countered. That Reaper definitely counters that Winston, but that's not really always how the game goes. And most of the time, there are ways to play around something that might have an advantaged fight against you in a certain situation. You just don't play towards that situation. Another example that happens is players are saying, hey, swap to a hit scan, and you'll have one hit scan, and that hit scan isn't capable of killing a Pharah and a Mercy that is also getting resources from their team, like a Diva is helping them or whatever the case may be, and they flame that hit scan. They're like, you're countering it, why can't you deal with this? And in their mind, they want freaking aimbot Calvin to two-tap that damn Pharah out of the air, even through healing. But is that realistic? Is that gonna actually happen in your games? Probably not. So you can see how the counter thing doesn't always work in ways that you intend it to, and also countering is more of a team effort than it is a solo one. You can't just expect your teammates to just counter easily whatever the enemy is playing, and this doesn't even take into account what your teammates can actually play. Because a lot of times players just like to suggest things, throw it out, even if the person that they're suggesting it to has no skill level or experience on the character. So like, hypothetically, let's say you get like a support, right? And you have like an Ana main, an Ana Zen main, and that person keeps getting dove, they get some value, they sleep a little bit, but they're still getting dove by multiple players, and you're like, hey, swap to Lucio so you don't get dove. But they have 2 hours on Lucio. Is that really what you want them to do, is to swap to Lucio when they have 2 hours on Lucio? You think they're going to be able to do anything impactful on Lucio? Now you have a heal-botting Lucio that doesn't make any plays because you instead would force what you want on them rather than trying to help them with what you can play. And this is where how flexible you are can come into the picture, because the more flexible you can be, the more you can help your teammates who are inflexible. This is really, really important because it's something that you can do to kind of help out your team, because not everyone is going to be able to play a lot of different things well. But if you can help out. But also, don't expect your teammates to be able to play everything under the sun. And also think about counters much more as a team thing rather than a individual thing. Now, the next misconception that often comes up is the I played well, but my team threw, that's why we lost. And the problem is sometimes this can be true. Sometimes you have a team that doesn't do what they're supposed to, or they int a very, very easy fight. Like y'all are walking into a fight with a ton of ultimates and it's the last fight, but like 2 people get picked before they use their ultimates. Obvious mistake, obvious team problem. Yeah, I understand. But there's a lot of times when you have a great game where you performed well the vast majority of the time, but you didn't follow through in the key moments that mattered. And I've done this myself. I've had games where I popped off, I had a ton of kills, low deaths, but in a very pivotal moment where if I would have performed well in that moment, we would have won, I actually didn't perform. I messed up, I made a misplay, and we lost. And it's easy to say, I had so much better stats, or oh, I was doing so good this game, why did we lose? But I also could be like, why did I mess up that last play? What if I just played that last play right and we would have won? So I would highly suggest, if you want to improve very quickly and faster than ever, you really, really need to focus on the plays of yours that went wrong, because there's always going to be some. There's always going to be a play that you went for, and maybe you were too aggressive. Maybe you tried to bite off more than you could chew. Maybe you messed up something mechanical, or your decision making was off. Whatever the case may be, focus on that. Don't focus on how well you performed. Don't focus on how bad your teammates threw. Focus on the moments, even in the games that you're popping off, that you could have performed better and closed out that game. But the last big misconceptions that we got to talk about are the big misconceptions that are plaguing tank, DPS, and support. And these are some big ones that I think are very, very important if you want to improve. The first thing is the tank player that thinks that they are only there to control and lock down the objective. And while that's somewhat true in a sense, it's more important for a tank to create space. This is why a tank's job is to close out a fight. This is why a tank's job is to not just sit on the cart as it's pushing. They're supposed to push forward. They're supposed to create space around the objective and in front of the objective. This is why oftentimes if you're pushing a cart, you don't want to keep 3 people on there. It doesn't matter that you're moving it faster if you're going to have more team fights. You want to have a tank that pushes up so that you can control more space and area, and your team can push up in retrospect so that you have a easier fight with more space. These are things that the game doesn't intrinsically teach you, but it's incredibly important if you want to climb. And this is another thing that is like just completely not measured by stats. Like your team could be popping off and really winning a ton of fights, but it's because you as a tank are creating a ton of space. And then there could be another game where you're not creating any space and your DPS are getting dominated on, and those stats are reflective of your space creation, but none of that is being recorded. So it's just a very important concept to fully grasp and how it links back to stats. Now the next thing is the DPS, and the biggest misconception that DPS players have is that they are supposed to kill tanks. Like, hey, there's a tank, kill the tank, shoot the tank, beat the tank up. And 90% of the time, you could shoot the tank like all day, every day, and you're never going to do anything. You're not going to be able to kill a tank unless they're way out of position or they're low on resources. What are their big resources? Typically, their supports. Their supports can just basically keep a tank up through hell itself. I mean, really, it's very, very hard to kill a tank. And oftentimes a DPS player does want to aid in preventing a tank from going wild. Like, you don't want like a fully charged Zarya to just be able to run around freely in your backline away from her team and just start killing people. That's definitely not what you want to have happen. And you need to have that Zarya at least to respect you a little bit or respect your team a little bit. But the vast majority of the time, as a DPS, you want to be looking for opportunities to make plays on other DPS or other supports. That's a really, really important thing, because you could shoot at a Zarya or an Orisa or a Rhine for maybe 2 minutes straight and no one dies. But you could spend a small window of time making a play on a support and kill them within 10 seconds. And you can really see how this circles back to the stats matter, because you could basically have a crazy amount of damage, and if your team just happens to win the fight, then you're gonna have a ton of damage and a ton of limbs. But if you're losing fights, you're gonna have a ton of damage and very little limbs and a lot of deaths and a lot of lost team fights, and you're gonna wonder why. You're gonna look at maybe your other DPS and that person's not gonna have hardly any damage, and you're gonna start flaming that person, but maybe that DPS was actually going for a play that would win the fight while you're just sitting there shooting at a tank for basically the end of time. And this is why these misconceptions kind of form, because people have an emphasis on stats, and sometimes it works. Like, sometimes just doing a whole bunch of damage to the front line actually gets you the win when the tank overextends, the supports don't even pay attention to them, or your other supports, tank, DPS, go and make a play that actually matters. And after that play happens, your damage on the front line actually matters as well. So it all comes together to kind of encourage bad habits, and it's really important that you don't always take things that work as things that you should always apply in the future. Now, last but certainly not least, we have the support role. And the problem with supports and the big misconceptions is there are people that think that supports should be fraggers and playmakers, and there's people that think that support should be healers. And oftentimes there is no nuance in that argument. Like, people say, hey, you're supposed to go make plays and damage more. Or people are like, what are you doing? Why aren't you healing? But a support is very, very hard to perfectly optimize, because there are times when you need to be damaging and making plays, and there are times when you need to be healing. And it's up to you to decide when and where which playstyle is most beneficial. You have a tank in front of you that's 1 HP and you're in a safe position, healing them makes the most sense. You're in a situation where your team is relatively decent health, or maybe one is even half health, but you have an opportunity to make a play that could get a pick, that could turn the team fight, whether it's a giant nade, whether it's a finished kill, whether it's getting the Widow off the high ground as Lucio, whatever the case may be. There are going to be situations where it's more beneficial for you to win the team fight, to make a play or deal some damage or use an ability rather than just heal your team. And the support problem is that you have to balance those things, and it's always different. Like, there's going to be some games where you're going to be healing a lot more, or some fights where you're going to be healing a lot more, and then on a dime, you're going to turn over and see an opportunity to make a play, and you're going to go for that play. So don't just think I need to do X or I need to do X. Think I need to be flexible and do what's going to actually lead me to win the team fight. And I know that that's very difficult to do, but it is why supporting is one of the hardest roles right now to get good at. But if you enjoyed the content, please smash that subscribe and like, and let me know down below what big misconceptions that you think the community has, and I'll see you next time.